Welcome in, everyone. We are jumping right into a deep dive today on a piece of source material that, well, at first glance, it might seem like it belongs entirely in a high school classroom.
Right, yeah.
But as we really dug into it, we realize it's actually this hidden blueprint for how to construct a bulletproof argument in the real world. The document is an educational guide, and it's called Mastering the LEQ Rubric for AP History Success.
I know. AP History rubric probably isn't the very first thing you think of when you're looking to, sharpen your professional skills
No, definitely not.
or win a debate, right? But if you look past that academic packaging, this is a phenomenal framework because, well, we live in an era defined by absolute information overload.
Oh, completely.
You are constantly being pitched to, argued at, bombarded with claims. So the ability to synthesize a mountain of facts, spot the underlying patterns, and then argue those complex points logically, that's an essential survival skill.
That is exactly why we're looking at this today. Because whether you, as the listener, are prepping for a high-stakes boardroom presentation or trying to convince a client to pivot their strategy, or just, I don't know, really wanting to understand how historical narratives and modern news stories are constructed,
Right.
this source provides the ultimate cheat sheet. Because if you know how to build a masterful argument, you also know how to dismantle a bad one.
Precisely. And the College Board uses this long essay question, the LEQ rubric, to grade students. But what they are really grading is a person's capacity for high-level persuasive communication.
Yeah, the mechanics of persuasion.
Exactly. And the guide breaks this down into 5 core elements. You have building a thesis, providing contextualization, deploying evidence, analyzing the reasoning, and finally, demonstrating complexity.
Okay, let's unpack this, starting with the absolute foundation, which the guide calls the thesis, or the claim point.
The anchor of the whole thing.
Right. If I'm trying to build an argument from scratch, where do most people usually go wrong right out of the gate?
The most common trap, without a doubt, is offering a vague observation instead of a defensible claim. The rubric is incredibly strict about this, actually.
How so?
Well, to build a proper foundation, your thesis has to do 3 distinct things. It must be historically defensible, it has to establish a clear line of reasoning, and this is the big one, it must directly answer the prompt.
Ah, so you can't just dodge the question.
Exactly. It cannot just be a restatement of the topic.
So if someone asks you a question, and you just slip the words around and hand it right back to them, like, say someone asks, how did global trade change in the early modern era?
Yeah.
And you reply with, global trade expanded from 1450 to 1750.
Right, which sounds like an answer, but it's completely meaningless as an argument.
Because it's too obvious.
Yes, trade expanded, but why? How? It's just an undeniable generic fact. You can't debate it, which means it isn't a thesis.
But the source material gives us this incredible formula for fixing that. I love this part. It's essentially a cheat code for building a claim.
The formula is fantastic.
It really is. The formula is, despite X, Y is true because A and B.
That formula is brilliant because it forces your brain to do several complex cognitive tasks all in one single sentence.
Right, break that down for us.
So by starting with despite X, you are immediately acknowledging a counterargument or a limiting factor. You are showing your audience right away that you understand the nuance of the situation.
You're not just wearing blinders.
Exactly. Then, stating why is true is your definitive claim. That's your flag in the ground. And finally, because A and B forces you to provide the specific themes or causes that prove your point, it basically gives your entire argument a structured roadmap.
But wait, if I use that in a real-world setting, wouldn't it sound a little robotic? Like, if I'm writing an email to my boss, do I really want to start with the word despite?
You don't have to use those exact rigid words, but the mechanics are what matter. Let's look at the historical examples first, and then we can translate it.
Okay, let's do it.
So instead of that bad thesis about trade just expanding, the successful version from the AP World History section uses the formula. It says, despite political fragmentation in Europe, the period 1450 to 1750 saw the expansion of global trade networks because European states sought economic gain and access to new resources.
Oh, that is so much stronger.
Right.
You have the, despite acknowledging the political fragmentation, you have the core claim about trade networks expanding, and then you have the because economic gain and new resources.
Exactly. And the guide has another great example for AP US history, looking at Reconstruction.
Oh, right. So the bad version would be something generic, like Reconstruction changed the South.
Which tells us nothing. The good version argues that, despite Southern resistance, constitutional amendments protecting African Americans succeeded because of federal legislation and civil rights activism.
See, that gives you a whole essay structure right there in one sentence.
Right.
There's one for AP Euro, too, about Napoleon, right?
Yes, bad version. Napoleon lost and Europe changed. Good version. Exploring how, despite revolutionary ideals spreading, the Congress of Vienna restored conservative order because major powers prioritized stability.
It's just night and day.
It really is. Now think about how to translate that mechanism to your own life, like a corporate pitch.
Okay.
Imagine you're pitching a new software rollout. The bad generic thesis is, we should adopt this new software to improve the company. It's vague.
Nobody's inspired by that.
Right. But if you use the formula's mechanics, you'd say, despite the initial high cost of onboarding, we must adopt this new software because it will eliminate redundancies in the sales pipeline and increase our quarterly retention rates.
I see what you did there. You address the elephant in the room immediately, the high cost. Then you make your decisive claim, and you back it up with two specific reasons: eliminating redundancies and increasing retention.
You are essentially planting your flag. The guide actually suggests that in a formal setting, you should always put this thesis as the absolute last sentence of your introduction.
Why the last sentence?
Because it creates a perfect transition. You guide your audience right up to the edge of your argument, make your definitive stance, and then spend the rest of your time proving it.
Which flows perfectly into the next element of the rubric. If the thesis is the destination we are trying to reach, the next step is drawing the map of how we got there. And the guide calls this contextualization.
Yes, contextualization. This is all about setting the stage. The rubric defines this as describing a broader historical context relevant to the prompt.
So zooming out.
Exactly. You are essentially zooming out to look at the big picture before you zoom in on your specific argument.
You know, we all have that one friend who tries to tell a story about something funny that happened at the grocery store, but they start the story like 5 years too early.
Oh, absolutely.
They give you all this completely irrelevant background information about their childhood before they even get to the checkout aisle.
What's fascinating here is that the guide explicitly warns against doing exactly that. Context shouldn't be a totally unrelated info dump. The most effective contextualization acts as a funnel.
A funnel. I like that visual.
It catches the broad, relevant realities of the world at that moment and funnels them directly into your specific thesis. The source provides a really solid strategy. You spend 2 to 3 sentences, starting with a time frame, move to a broad trend, and then directly link that trend to your thesis.
It mentions using a specific starter phrase.
Yeah, the go-to starter is something like, by this time period, this specific trend or event shaped this region.
Okay, so let's look at the AP World example they give for this, which is the Columbian Exchange. For anyone who might not remember, that was the massive transfer of plants, animals, culture, populations between the Americas and the Old World after Columbus.
Right.
The basic failing approach to setting the stage is just saying the Columbian Exchange happened in the 16th century.
Which, again, tells the audience absolutely nothing they didn't already know. But the sophisticated example from the text uses that funnel method. It says, by the 16th century, the Columbian Exchange had reshaped the global economy, linking the Americas, Europe, and Africa, and altering labor systems and trade patterns.
It sets the stage so beautifully. You know immediately that the writer understands the sheer scale of the event.
They aren't just talking about ships crossing an ocean.
No, they're talking about a reshaped global economy and altered labor systems.
And that builds immense credibility with your audience right out of the gate. Let's look at the APUSH siege example the guide gives for the American Revolution in 1776.
Yeah.
It is absolutely not enough to just say, the colonies wanted independence. That ignores why they wanted it and what the preceding decades actually looked like.
Right. The masterful context the guide provides explains that by 1776, tensions between Britain and the colonies had steadily grown. But it doesn't stop there.
It has to go deeper.
It weaves in specific trends like taxation without representation, the impact of imperial policies, and the gradual process of colonial identity formation.
By doing that, you are telling your audience, to understand the claim I am about to make regarding independence, you first have to understand the environment of taxation and identity that made independence inevitable.
It proves you understand the ecosystem, not just isolated data points.
Precisely. And in AP Euro, they talk about late 17th century absolutist monarchs. It's not just monarchs had power, it's about how centralizing authority and controlling economies actually set the stage for later revolutions.
So whether you are analyzing absolutist monarchs or analyzing a shift in modern consumer behavior, establishing why the environment was ripe for change is crucial.
It sets you up for success.
Okay, so we had set the stage with our context, and we have planted our flag with an ironclad thesis. Now, we need to bring the receipts. The third element of the rubric is the evidence point, or points, really.
You cannot just make sweeping claims, you need concrete proof. The rubric requires at least 2 pieces of specific and relevant evidence to support an argument. We are talking about specific people, specific laws, treaties, or events.
No vague generalizations.
Well, none, and you have to explicitly connect them to your point.
The guide calls this the doc plus outside evidence mentality. You can't just drop a term into a sentence and hope it works. You have to actively deploy it. The suggested phrasing is literally, for example, this piece of evidence demonstrates this connection.
Let's go back to that AP World idea of global trade expanding. You cannot just write, the Americas traded with Europe. It is far too vague. You need to name the specific goods and their impacts.
So what's the better version?
The source suggests pointing to New World crops like potatoes and maize and explaining how they directly increased European populations, or citing how silver from the Americas specifically fueled global trade networks.
Potatoes, maize, and silver. When you name the actual crops and the actual precious metal, it completely changes the dynamic of the argument.
It feels tangible.
Yeah. It's the difference between telling your partner, our car is getting old, we should buy a new one, versus saying, the alternator failed twice last month and cost us $800. We are losing money by keeping this car.
Specificity is the soul of persuasion. When you provide concrete evidence, you leave very little room for your audience to doubt your premise.
What about the APUSH example for evidence?
Oh, for APESH, instead of vaguely stating civil rights improved during Reconstruction, the guide says you have to cite the Emancipation Proclamation of 1863 and the 14th Amendment.
Actual legal document.
Exactly. And the guide highlights an example from AP European history regarding religious treaties. It's really good. Instead of a vague statement like, there were treaties and religious changes in Europe, the successful evidence points directly to the Edict of Nantes in 1598 and the Peace of Westphalia in 1648.
Let's break those down just a bit for anyone who hasn't taken a European history class recently.
Yeah.
The Edict of Nantes was crucial because it granted substantial rights and religious toleration to Protestants in Casual France, right?
Yes.
And the Peace of Westphalia essentially ended the horrific 30 Years' War.
Correct. And see, those aren't just vocabulary words to memorize. They are massive turning points in human history. By deploying them explicitly in an argument, the writer proves they possess the necessary raw materials to build their case.
So the overarching rule for you listening is to continually ask yourself the rubric's golden question. Does this directly prove my thesis?
That's the test.
Because if you are presenting data in a meeting, and that data doesn't directly support the claim you made at the beginning of the pitch, you were basically just throwing a spreadsheet at your audience and hoping they figure it out.
Which is a very dangerous game to play with an audience. Evidence without connection is just trivia. You have to guide them, which brings us to the most analytical part of the rubric.
Here's where it gets really interesting. Because having the evidence isn't enough. The fourth element is analysis and reasoning. I like to call this the so what factor.
That's a great name for it.
The rubric demands that you show why your evidence matters using historical reasoning. We're talking causation, comparison, continuity, and change.
This is the moment you elevate yourself from someone who just researches facts to someone who actively analyzes them.
Right.
The mental model the source provides is a chain of events. Cause leads to effect, which then links back to the thesis. You should be aiming for 1 to 2 sentences of deep reasoning for every single piece of evidence you introduce.
The guide suggests using signal phrases like, this demonstrates, or consequently, to let your audience know you are doing the analytical heavy lifting for them.
Let's look at that silver trade example again.
Right.
We established the evidence. Silver came from the Americas to Europe. The bad analysis just stops there and says silver came from the Americas and Europe got richer.
It is a flat, one-dimensional observation.
But the expert analysis looks at the causal relationships, the ripple effects. It explains how that massive influx of silver didn't just enrich European empires. It actually led to severe inflation.
Unintended consequences.
Right, and that inflation consequently incentivized those empires to expand their maritime exploration even further to seek out more wealth.
You are showing the mechanics of the event, not just the outcome. It's the difference between saying, I ate a sandwich and felt better, and saying, the carbohydrates in the sandwich provided the necessary glucose for my brain to overcome the afternoon slump. You are explaining the why.
Exactly. Or take the APUSH example. The Reconstruction Amendments didn't just change laws, they fundamentally reshaped the balance of federal and state power in the United States.
That's a much bigger claim.
Let's look at the Peace of Westphalia again, too. The basic analysis is it ended a war. But the high-level reasoning explains that by ending the 30 Years' War, the treaty reinforced state sovereignty, created a precedent for modern international relations, and fundamentally limited the church's influence over political affairs.
That is a massive leap in quality. You are connecting a 17th century peace treaty to the very foundation of how modern nations interact with each other today. That is the so what in action.
You aren't just listing facts, you are explaining their weight.
So when you present facts, do you just list them, or do you actively explain the causal relationships to your audience?
Because if you leave the so what up to your audience, they might draw the completely wrong conclusion. Or worse, they might just decide they don't care.
Yeah, apathy is the worst outcome.
When you are presenting an argument, whether it's an essay on Reconstruction shifting the balance of federal power, or a business proposal explaining why a new market trend requires a change in strategy, you have to walk your audience step by step through your reasoning.
And once you have done that, once your reasoning is sound, you reach the final, most challenging part of the rubric. The guide calls it the complexity point. This is basically the final boss of argument construction.
It truly is. The College Board allocates entirely separate points for this, and it requires demonstrating a complex understanding of the subject through sophisticated argumentation. It is about pushing past a black and white view of the world.
The source is very clear. You cannot just be a cheerleader for your own thesis. You have to show multiple perspectives, acknowledge connections across different regions, and display a nuanced understanding that goes way beyond your basic claim. You have to see the whole playing field.
And the strategy outlined in the text is incredibly practical for this. It suggests breaking down complexity by comparing across time periods or regions.
How does that look in practice?
Well, you use structural phrasing to hold two potentially conflicting truths at the same time. You use phrases like, while X was true, Y also, or although X, Y happened.
Let's look at how the guide applies this to the silver trade, because this part blew my mind.
It's a great example.
We already established that silver made Europe rich but caused inflation. But to earn the complexity point, the writer has to look even further. The successful example points out that the global silver trade not only transformed Europe, but it simultaneously caused severe economic disruption in China.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, that is true global interconnectedness. You are avoiding single perspective thinking. The writer recognizes that a boom in one hemisphere can trigger a vacuum or a crisis in another. Acknowledging that level of interconnected consequence shows profound mastery of the topic.
It is so sophisticated.
And we see that same tension in the guide's APUSH example about Reconstruction.
Right.
The complex argument notes that while there were massive legislative successes, like the constitutional amendments protecting African Americans, those federal laws alone could not instantly enforce social change because they were met with severe white supremacist resistance.
For pushback.
Yes. And crucially, it connects that resistance to a later time period, noting this was a pattern repeated during the Jim Crow era.
By acknowledging the resistance and connecting it to future historical patterns, the argument becomes incredibly robust. The guide also looks at the era of Napoleon for AP Euro to show this. The complex argument identifies the inherent tension of that period. Napoleon's conquests actually spread revolutionary ideals like meritocracy and certain legal rights across the continent. But the subsequent Congress of Vienna worked desperately to suppress those ideals and restore conservative monarchies.
It demonstrates the push and pull of history. Progress and change are rarely linear. It is a constant tug-of-war between revolutionary ideas and conservative restoration. Complexity is about mapping out that entire tug-of-war rather than just picking one side and pretending the other side doesn't exist.
When you bring this tactic into your daily life, it actually builds an immense amount of trust with your audience. If you were writing an op-ed or sending a proposal to a client, acknowledging the potential downsides or the counterarguments doesn't weaken your point. It shows you have thought of everything.
It shows you aren't hiding anything.
Exactly. It takes your argument from feeling like a biased sales pitch to feeling like an objective, masterful analysis.
So, as we wrap up, let's pull all of this together. We've journeyed through the 5 elements of building a bulletproof argument based on this AP rubric.
We started with the foundation, building a defensible, nuanced thesis using the magic formula of despite XY is true because A and B.
Then we set the stage with contextualization, zooming out to capture the broad trends of the era and funneling them directly into our specific argument.
From there, we brought the receipts. We deployed specific, concrete evidence, avoiding vague generalizations and ensuring every fact directly supported our claim.
Then we did the heavy analytical lifting. We answered this "so what" by forging clear causal links between our evidence and our thesis.
And finally, we embraced complexity. We demonstrated higher-order thinking by acknowledging multiple perspectives, regional impacts, and the push and pull of opposing forces. I want to sincerely thank you for joining us on this deep dive. I know we spent our time analyzing an AP history grading rubric, but I hope you see how universally powerful these tools really are.
They absolutely are.
Whether you are actually sitting down to write an essay, trying to untangle a complicated issue in the daily news, or preparing to advocate for something you deeply believe in at work or at home, moving from vague assertions to masterful, defensible reasoning is a superpower. You have the blueprint now.
The rubric's requirement for complexity forces us to see that historical change always comes with resistance and unintended consequences, like silver transforming Europe but disrupting China, or new laws failing to change society without a cultural shift. If that is the benchmark for understanding the past, it raises an important question. When you look at the historic events unfolding in the news right now, are you actively searching for that complex multi-regional ripple effect? Or are you just settling for a vague thesis?